So recently, I did a poll asking you guys what type of city you live in. The results were quite varied. I also noticed that there seems to be a little confusion between what constitutes a suburb, an exurb, or simply a small town. So in this video, I'm going to be breaking down the different types of cities and clarifying what characteristics to look for when determining this. But first, I want to welcome you guys back to the channel. I'm Mileage Mike, a frequent traveler, civil engineer, and geography enthusiast. On this channel, we travel all over America's cities, highways, infrastructure, and more recently, we're also discussing various topics related to those things. So if you enjoy this type of content, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe for more. Now, back to the cities. Before we get into that, I'll go ahead and mention that I use metro populations for discussing city sizes, as city population is mostly useless. I'll link the video in the description where I broke down why this is the case. First, we'll talk about the most obvious type of city, the major city. There are some variations and different opinions on what defines a major city versus a small or medium-sized city, but in my personal opinion, I define a major city as one with at least 1 million people in the metro area. Major cities typically are the center of commercial, cultural, and industrial activity for a given area. People from surrounding areas usually commute into these cities for employment as well as entertainment opportunities. Examples include New York City, Chicago, Houston, Miami, Atlanta, Washington, D.C., among others. You get the idea. I couldn't add any more options to the poll, but I like to add a tier between the major city and small city. Under 1 million people, but more than 500,000, I refer to as a mid-sized city. These cities usually anchor an area like major cities, but they will have less suburbs surrounding them and a less dense urban core. Sometimes they're in close proximity to a larger metro area and may be included in the CSA of larger city. A good example of this is Durham, North Carolina, which has around 650,000 people in its own metro, but lies next to the Raleigh metro, which has around 1.4 million in population. Other examples include Greenville, South Carolina, Knoxville, Tennessee, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and El Paso, Texas. Small cities have less than 500,000 in the metro. These are your Asheville, North Carolina, Savannah, Georgia, Gainesville, Florida, Charleston, West Virginia, and such. Usually they are surrounded by rural areas and serve as a center of activity for those sparsely populated areas. Now let's talk suburbs. This is where things get interesting and confusing. Most people are familiar with the broad definition, the look and feel of your typical suburb. Just the mention of the term brings to mind large single-family lots, similar-looking houses lining winding streets with cul-de-sacs, two-car garages, and nice, well-manicured green lawns. The image sold to Americans in the 1950s as the American dream. Suburbs are primarily residential in nature, with the dominant commercial activity being large strip malls with large parking lots, big box stores, chain restaurants with little to no sidewalks or transit. You must have a car, ideally the biggest, baddest SUV you can find. Developments are usually set back far from the roadway, so even when there are sidewalks present, they are rarely used. Most residents in suburbs drive on freeways to get into the core city that they surround for jobs and entertainment. However, suburbs have evolved somewhat since the 1950s. There are some suburban towns that have their own employment centers now. Some suburbs now have large populations that compete with larger core cities in terms of number of residents. For the suburban example, what better city to use than Atlanta? It has endless amounts of them. Popular suburbs in the area include Sandy Springs, East Cobb, Roswell, Alpharetta, and Kennesaw. These towns are primarily residential and rely on the core city of Atlanta for most things. Cities like Sandy Springs still have their water and sewer services through Atlanta, and many homes still have Atlanta addresses. In recent times, Sandy Springs, for example, has been trying to build its own commercial center and entertainment area independent of the city of Atlanta. Driving down the Atlanta Autobahn, one can even see a few skyscrapers in the area. While places like East Cobb and Milton look like your traditional residential/big box shopping suburb. Today, suburbs dominate American development and are the fastest growing type of city in the country. Most Americans envision the suburban lifestyle and image when they hear the term American dream. This next type of town is where things get a little more tricky. Notice I didn't mention popular cities like Marietta, Lawrenceville, or Douglasville when discussing suburbs. What makes these places different from the typical suburb? These cities are what we call satellite cities. Satellite cities are cities that are usually the county seat and or largest city in an outlying county from the core city. They had their own downtown urban core and employment centers historically, but due to the growth of the larger city they surround, these cities began to blend in and merge with nearby suburban development. Up here in Charlotte, the satellite cities are Gastonia, Concord, Monroe, Rock Hill. Take a look at your area and see if you can identify the satellite cities. Beyond the suburbs, we have what is now referred to as an exurb. Exurbs are towns that form a sort of outer ring around the suburbs that surround the core city. Exurbs are less developed than suburbs. They typically are more rural in character, and living in them usually requires commuting into the suburbs or the core city for employment, shopping, medical, and entertainment services. In Atlanta, these would be areas like Beaufort, Cumming, and Peachtree City. There is also yet another type of town that sort of borders on being suburban and exurban. This is called the commuter town. Commuter towns are heavily residential cities with very little commercial or industrial development, where the vast majority of the population commutes into a nearby larger city for employment. Commuter towns in some cases have populations that are close to or even exceed those of the nearby cities that residents commute to. I found a lot of these on my travels around Florida. Cities such as Deltona, Palm Coast, and Spring Hill with very high populations, but no traditional downtown, and mostly low-density residential areas. I found these cities very frustrating to drive around, but hey, it seems like the people in Florida love them. The final and surprisingly most desirable type of city, according to you guys, is the rural town. These are small towns, usually an hour or more from the major city, with large swaths of open land, farms, and very limited shopping and commercial areas. You can own a lot and never have to see nor hear your neighbors. You can blast your music as loud as you want, burn trash in your yard, and in some cases, you can even get some practice in with your firearms in peace. Land is usually cheaper per acre. You can grow your own food and almost live completely off the land. However, you must own a car or some form of motorized transportation to get around. And in case of emergencies, such as fire or police, you might be waiting a while. Alright, there you have it, guys. Those are the primary types of cities that define America. What type of city do you live in right now? What type of city would you like to live in? Are you in the metro area? Do you think it's okay for someone from the suburbs to tell people that they're from the core city? For example, should a guy from Sandy Springs be able to tell people that he's from Atlanta? Do you disagree with some of my assessments of city types? Would you add or leave some out? Let me know what you think in the comments. As always, thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next trip, coming soon to a town near you.